If there was one constant as a Sega Genesis owner, it was that you were going to find really difficult games. In part 1, I went over some of the games that really handed me my ass, but one single episode wasn't enough to contain all the difficult games I encountered for the platform. In part 2 here, we are going to look at even more games that I found difficult, including a few options to ease some of the pain. Let's take a look at really difficult Sega Genesis games, part 2. A lot of folks wondered why Contra Hardcore wasn't in part 1. Simply put, the North American version was not the way I played the game initially. My fixation with the Japanese Mega Drive had me importing that version a few months after the North American launch. The Japanese version is known as Contra the Hardcore, and added a hit point system that allowed you to take 3 hits before you lost a life. This of course made the game easier than the North American release, but wasn't the primary reason why. The Japanese version also allowed for unlimited continues, something the North American game limited to 3. This meant that not only was the Japanese version easier to get into for your average gamer, but it also was more forgiving with your time investment. Make no mistake though, both these versions are still challenging, one is just more accessible than the other. You need to master the slide mechanic to have any hope of defeating either one, and some of the boss battles will test even the most skilled among us. I always loved firing this up because of the graphics and sound, both of which have the Genesis hardware singing in unison. It has 2-player co-op as well, adding to its incredible replay value. European gamers can play it too, where it's known as Probotector and has a number of visual changes. Much the same as Contra Hardcore, I'd import Bare Knuckle 3 in 1994. This was the Japanese version of Streets of Rage 3. I couldn't understand the story worth a damn, but it was a great beat 'em up that expanded the enemy diversity and their movesets over the first 2 games. I found its co-op to be really fun, and it offered some decent challenge. Little did I know that later that year, Sega of America would almost completely retool the release for the North American market. Characters would be altered visually, and even some removed entirely. There would also be radical alterations to the story, something I actually wouldn't realize until years later. But the real kicker was the complete overhaul to the difficulty levels. The normal setting in the North American release was freaking brutal, with hard damn near impossible. You also could no longer defeat the game on easy, instead getting a game over after the 5th level. I'm not gonna lie to you guys here. I much prefer the Japanese release of this one. It isn't that I do not want challenge in my games, but sometimes challenge can come at the expense of fun factor. While I am able to defeat the English release by myself, co-op usually would see my partner not make it nearly as far, an issue I never had in the first 2 games or the Japanese release. As far as I know, the European version retains nearly all the changes from the North American game. Sega was notorious for publishing hard games for the Genesis and Mega Drive platform, with few being more challenging than the adventures of Batman and Robin. This mix of run and gun and beat 'em up action was a really impressive game late in the life of the system. Not only did it have a pretty damn good soundtrack, but it also was loaded with really cool special effects and piled the screen full of sprites that were exceptionally well animated. The action here is relentless, giving you few breaks to catch your breath. Enemies are all over you nearly from the moment you take control of the Caped Crusader, and you'll need to work overtime to keep from seeing the game over screen quickly. One of the nice things about this one is the fact that it's completely different from the other releases under this name. The Super Nintendo, Sega CD, and Game Gear games are all radically different designs, and I feel this is the best version of this game by quite a stretch. If you are having trouble getting anywhere in this one, Be sure to enlist some help from a friend and take advantage of the 2-player co-op it features. Not only does it kick up the fun factor significantly, it also makes the game a tad bit easier. Sometimes games are difficult as hell simply because the gameplay isn't very good. Few games on the Genesis were stronger embodiments of that truth than 1991's Fantasia. As a big fan of Castle of Illusion, I had wanted this one the day it was released. My surprise at how poorly it played puts this one among one of the biggest disappointments for the Genesis. Enemies are much faster than you, and the lag between when you press the jump button and when you actually animated was terrible, making navigating even the very first level a pain in the ass. This only got worse as the game would go on and become more difficult, with everything in the environment causing you harm. Even Sega's own head of product development has admitted to the game being unplayable in its current state. He would say in 2006, "Yeah, the graphics were wonderful and they really caught the mood. They did some really cool things with parallax scrolling in there, but again, hindsight's 2020. I wish now that I would have said no and sent it back for another 2 months or so to tweak the gameplay. I think it could have been a really fantastic game if we had done that." I really think that says it all right there. There is such a thing as good difficult and bad difficult in video games. This one was definitely the latter. Sometimes a game will hook you no matter its quality. It will just have some intangible that drives you to play it regardless. This happened to me in 1991 when my best friend picked up Fatal Rewind. It's a run-and-gun platformer that has you collecting keys to open pathways set against a timer that fills the screen with deadly lava. You get power-ups and life replenishment strewn throughout the stage to help you. I didn't think much of this when I first played it. It didn't look or sound good to me, nor was its gameplay particularly fun. Something just kept pulling at me to try and defeat it, however, and man was it a frustrating experience. Death comes frequently here, sometimes from missed jumps or enemies, and sometimes from falling into the ever-rising river of lava. I wish I could regale you with my story of triumph and how I overcame this challenge. It wasn't meant to be, however, and I was never able to beat this one. Replaying it here reminded me that there are just some games out there that have your number no matter what. When Splatterhouse II landed on the Genesis, I was excited as hell. I was a big fan of the arcade and TurboGrafx original, and I played it so much I could easily defeat them both. I quickly found Splatterhouse II to be a fair bit more challenging, especially in the later stages. It was such an incredibly good-looking game and the gameplay was very faithful to the first, so I just had to keep at it. The password system in this one definitely helped me, mainly because you didn't need to keep replaying earlier stages over and over to get to the real challenge. Anyone who puts in the time will likely triumph in this one, but it's still a heck of a challenge, especially when you crank up the difficulty. There's also a part 3 to the series on the Genesis and Mega Drive that really changed up the gameplay formula, but was no less fun. If you like arcade-style action games with a little blood and gore, this one gives you all you'll ever need. I would have two very different experiences with our last game, Battletoads. I had loved the arcade version of the game upon its release, being blown away by its great special effects and multiplayer action. I actually had been exposed to the NES version years before, but did not enjoy that game at all, preferring the likes of the more modern Streets of Rage and Final Fight. A friend of mine was absolutely enthralled with the Genesis game, dragging me kicking and screaming with him. The Genesis version was based on the NES original, and boy does it look it. While it does look better than its source material, the overall feeling here screams 8-bit. Sprites are small and backgrounds are simple, leading me to ask my buddy why the hell he was wanting to play it so much. I realized when he looked at me with that familiar, half-crazed gleam in his eye, it was because he couldn't beat it alone. I was going to be his wingman on this one whether I wanted to or not. Honestly, much of this game isn't difficult at all, I found. The beat-em-up areas will be adjusted to quickly and you'll be whooping ass in no time. However, the vehicle stages are another thing altogether. Your life bar here doesn't really matter, as insta-deaths are the name of the game. Miss a jump? Dead. Hit an obstacle? Dead. You can be a beast during the fighting areas, only to lose everything in seconds during these stages. Watching my daughter trying to get the timing down here was both hilarious and insightful. Her reactions scarily close to my own younger self. So there we go, some more Genesis and Mega Drive games I have found to have some really solid challenge. Of course guys, there are many more that need covering, and I am certainly open to a part 3. This subject will never be complete until I get up enough courage to tackle the brutal Target Earth again. The pain of its thorough beating of my ass in the early 90s still fresh in my mind. I'm SEEEGAAAA X. Thank you guys for watching, and I will catch you next time.